So we've covered a lot of ground. One of the, as you've gathered, one of the characteristics of this area of policy is that it involves a number of small policies which are very diffuse and operate by their own rules. And, so we'll get a chance in the course of the Q&A to perhaps talk a little bit more about how those work. And feel free, if from the original presentations there's a particular program that was referenced, to just ask how it works. Because I think this is an area of public policy which has, in some respects, sort of thrived on the complexity of the various programs. And it's often difficult to get a handle on all that's going on. So we have, I think, a wide range of perspective on this issue at different levels of government and different levels of sort of skepticism and enthusiasm as to what kind of a public policy this tool this is. So I'll take your question.
It's an economic development tool for Dubuque right now. You know, we are marketing ourselves as a sustainable community. IBM's investing big dollars to help us with that. We're working on anything. A.Y. McDonald is a large manufacturer, a 140-year-old manufacturer in our town. They make all the piping and plumbing for city sewers and everything. If you walk down the street, you'll see A.Y. McDonald, you know, stamped on the stuff that's in the street. We're actually working with our business community, and they're making meters to figure out, put on homes that will tell homeowners whether or not they have leaks. And so it's little things like that that they're putting into policy to become more green, and that will attract workers, which IBM wants, and so it kind of goes full circle. You know, you can attract a workforce by being greener. People like that. IBM likes that. They invest in it, so you continue the cycle.
Well, I think we should define terms, just be careful. Because based on the show of hands, very few people know what LEED is.
Leadership in Energy Efficient.
Leadership in Environmental Energy Design, which is a standard set of metrics promoted by a group called the U.S. Green Building Council, usgbc.org. And there's several different kinds of LEED standards for different, either new construction, commercial real estate, new construction, residential, retrofitting of existing commercial buildings, LEED EB for existing building, and the newest standard, which my board chairman helped create, called LEED ND, or LEED Neighborhood Design, which is what you were asking about. Please.
Well, and I want to use another geeky term, smart growth principles. And one of the things that Iowa City is doing to capitalize on how we are already laid out and designed as a community is we're partnering with our largest employer, the university, to develop and reinvest in neighborhoods that are adjacent to the university to reestablish the balance between owner-occupied and rental. Not to say that we don't appreciate the rental and the mix in those close-in neighborhoods. So taking advantage of close-in neighborhoods and encouraging people at a major employer to live close enough to walk or bike to work, I think, is a fundamental principle that eliminates sort of that sprawl. We have a huge labor shed area in Iowa City and throughout Iowa, and the more that we can do to focus on our large employers and build up the strengths that we have in communities that have developed around them. Once again, we're doing that a little bit in Towncrest as well. So part of economic development is linked to the land use and how you approach that and how you allow that development to occur or incent that development in different ways.
And actually, LEED doesn't necessarily help that land use because LEED doesn't give a lot of points for the reuse of a building unless you get into the upper level. You can become a silver or gold LEED building and not have reused an existing structure. It takes a lot less energy to reuse an existing structure, and you might not be able to obtain silver or gold doing it. The standards are kind of skewed in a weird way.
I think what we have to do as communities, states, whatever, is decide what our objectives are in how we use environmental principles and use the tools, LEED, or what is most appropriate to achieve those objectives.
I mean, what's interesting about this, I think, is in your answers, what comes across is this can be a selling point for a community.
Yes.
And so that's one aspect of economic development. It can also be, in the terms Greg laid out at the beginning, something you ask for in return for the public subsidy. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the parking lot across from Starbucks, the perennial building
Yes,
we never
Hieronymus
built.
Square.
The Hieronymus Square, you know the one, I mean,
Yes.
just down here. The developers proposed a TIF development. People know what a TIF is?
And we have a TIF contract for
Right.
that.
But the city was very aggressive in making sure to get something in exchange, because here you have a highly desirable parcel. It's not difficult to persuade a developer to put something there. And so that's a case where, you know, the economic development is used to get something in exchange. In this case, fairly high-end environmental standards for the building, which otherwise a developer might not do on their own.
So through my monomaniacal lens of accountability, when I hear the business case for green building construction, when the Green Building Council policy director tells me that the average payback period for retrofitting a building to LEED standards, the break-even period on energy savings, is less than 3 years. When Adobe software company retrofits their headquarters in San Jose, it pays for itself in 10 months. When Harvard University creates a revolving loan fund to retrofit its old campus buildings, and the rate of return on that revolving loan fund is 35%, more than twice the rate of its endowment, I say to myself, why would anybody give anybody a TIF, or anybody give anybody a property tax abatement, unless they require them to act in their own economic self-interest by retrofitting to LEED standards?
And I will say in my work with Vision Iowa, we've required some LEED standards in some of the projects that we've partnered on, and it's very difficult to get people to embrace LEED standards because their architects will tell them that there's a cost involved, and because of certification. And so it's very difficult, and we can push them because we're giving them grants, and that's beneficial. But there's a lot of misunderstanding about the paybacks.
You know, in terms of walkable communities, it was kind of an interesting project that I worked on when I was back in the state. And it involved the city of Des Moines, and they basically ended up having to compete against West Des Moines. The city of Des Moines is downtown historic infrastructure. Needs to be walkable. The city requires walkability. So in this case, I'll say who it was. It's Nationwide Insurance. Basically built 3 blocks of structure in the end in Des Moines. And the city was going to require that they have lower level retail, kind of mixed use, because they just didn't want this wall of institutional stuff because it didn't make a very interesting Main Street. Well, they were competing with West Des Moines and a place in Florida. And West Des Moines, you're building in the middle of a cornfield. They don't care whether or not you put, they don't necessarily want those stores out there. It doesn't make sense to do mixed use. So that's where it becomes really hard when you're competing between these artificial political jurisdictions when they have different kind of neighborhood fabrics.
I guess my question is more of a global question. What can any of you say about disincentives or incentives for companies to move overseas?
I'll take that one. We just did a study in Pennsylvania about high technology companies, and we looked at over a long period of time, where jobs are coming from. There's actually a great database called NETS that I would recommend to every public official, which enables you to say how many jobs in any particular sector of the economy come from startups, from the deaths of firms, from expansions or contractions, or from in-migrations or out-migrations within the United States. And then there's another database at the Department of Labor that certifies layoffs that are caused by imports or by offshore job flights. So you can put all those together and answer the question where have high-tech jobs been coming from or going in a particular state over a long period of time. And what we found is that the war among the states is completely irrelevant. Over a long period of time, the net gain in jobs and loss in firms for Pennsylvania was microscopic. It affected less than 1/10 of firms and jobs in any given year. In recent years, especially since 2003, offshore job flight has been a real issue. It's a real problem. But and from an economic development point of view, here's the challenge: that you can't fix federal trade policy with state or local tax policy. And if a company has the ability to move production to a low-wage market because of whatever it does or makes, the savings it will achieve doing that dwarf anything you could do with the tax code. But the trouble is, a lot of politicians don't know that. And they'll actually sell incentives as a remedy for globalization. And you're talking lemons and watermelons. So,
Take that a step further and
Yeah.
think about the competition between cities and political jurisdictions in a state that's even more minuscule. But I will tell you, I've at least anecdotally seen companies in the telemarketing area who have taken their operations overseas and now are bringing it back because of some of the quality factors, frustration with the language barriers. So, where we have to focus our competition is quality rather than cost.
Are there specific, I've heard, just in general about incentives or tax credits that companies get when they offshore.
sure, yeah, this is arcane in the federal corporate income tax code. There's things like the ability of companies to keep offshore profits offshore and and therefore not have them taxed at the U.S. corporate income tax rate, which is higher than some other countries. And there was a repatriation program set up, kind of an amnesty program to let them bring them back at a lower rate for a while, for instance, that didn't do very well. But these are, again, are federal issues. These are federal tax issues and federal trade policy issues. And frankly, WTO global trade agreement issues. And they're a real issue right now, for instance, in green jobs. We just helped do a study with the Apollo Works looking at companies that got something called the Advanced Manufacturing Energy Tax Credit. It's one of the programs under the Recovery Act. There were several companies in Iowa and many of the Midwest that benefit from this program. But if you look at who got the incentives, about more than a fourth of them are foreign-based companies. And even those that are domestically headquartered, some of them, as best we can tell, based on their recent activities and announcements, really don't see a future or much of a future in growing their capacity here in the United States. They love this as a platform. They'd love to sell solar panels and windmills here, but they're not necessarily going to make them here. And I'm very much in the camp that says we should be using the same kinds of trade practices that our trading partners use. Call it mercantilism, call it pushing the envelope on what the WTO allows. But we can't afford to not capture a lot of good jobs in the renewable energy revolution.
Could you just stay on that one point about the companies moving overseas and the incentives with that amnesty program you were talking about? The fear then, if we made that permanent, is that they take their headquarters outside of the United States. Is that a legitimate fear?
So the question about, is it a legitimate fear that some companies would even move more complex operations, including corporate headquarters overseas, without repatriation penalties for foreign profits? I haven't looked at that issue. I don't want to opine there. I mean, certainly there's some kinds of industries which for long periods of time have located large shares of high value-added production offshore, pharmaceuticals in Ireland, etc., because of tax loopholes, corporate income tax loopholes. I also worked for a long time on an issue of a loophole called 936, which was explained why Puerto Rico was such a highly concentrated pharmaceutical production center for so long. But there were, I discovered, dozens of companies that had been violating both federal and Commonwealth of Puerto Rico rules about relocating jobs there that formed the basis of a RICO lawsuit in the early 90s. I think, and this is a federal tax policy issue, it's not a state or Iowa issue, so we're a little bit off our subject here for tonight, but I think Uncle Sam has been really too passive. We have the word industrial policy is kind of a dirty word. It was a dirty word from the Cold War. It invoked, centralism, central planning in the economy, and to this day, people think of it as a dirty word, that Uncle Sam might be self-interested in protecting our manufacturing base and closing tax loopholes to deter capital flight. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and our trading partners all do it, and that's why we have such big trade deficits with so many of them, in my opinion.
I'd go back to Mary's point as well. I mean, it's your father's economic development policy, which was driven by simply reducing the costs of doing business, particularly on the labor side, and the end result of that is you leave the country. particularly in labor-intensive industry. There's a wonderful book that I recommend, particularly to the historians in the audience, called Capital Moves by Jefferson Cowie, where he traces the movement of RCA, which starts in Camden, New Jersey. And then in Chapter 2, they're in Bloomington, Indiana, because Indiana threw lots of money at them and promised them a low-wage workforce of basically farm wives who would work in the electrical manufacturing. And then in Chapter 3, they're in Memphis, one of these southern settings that promises an even lower wage, in this case, right-to-work, non-union area. They get to Memphis, of course, right at the wrong time when the civil rights movement explodes. And where are they now? Mexico. And the cover of his book has this map of RCA walking down the continent out of the country.
Because the housing would pay, less than half of the assessed value, and taxes pay no property, or schools pay no property taxes. So that particular community would struggle if all the industrial were next door.
I'm sorry. The general policy lesson here is you don't want your tax policies to distort land use or grid planning or transportation systems. You don't, not only do you get the penalty of lower property taxes on residential here, but you have higher costs because they've got kids. You've got to be educated. Public education is the most expensive local public service, so it's a double penalty for housing. It's another way that suburban zoning laws fuel sprawl and penalize and discourage, for instance, multifamily housing. Exclusionary zoning by suburbs is done for the same reason. Right? So you want to, and the remedy obviously is regional tax-based systems that do not penalize any one small local body of government for its particular mix of land uses.
As far as the case of Dubuque and IBM, obviously you're right. You've got Wisconsin and Illinois within a pretty close radius. Now, was that a draw for IBM in the Dubuque case, or was that an issue? I guess I don't know enough about the tax policy.
One of the things that I hear from IBM now is that it was the number of educational institutions in the area. There are 3 fairly large private colleges in Dubuque. Platteville has another university. You have the community college up there. You have University of Iowa that's close. You have Kirkwood that's not that far away. There are a lot of educational entities that are graduating young professionals in an area that's right kind of smack dab between Chicago and Minneapolis and St. Louis, and on a river, lots of recreational amenities. They wanted to be in the historic downtown. They didn't want to go build on the edge of a city. They wanted to do a reuse thing. Lots of opportunities for that in Dubuque. It's the oldest city in Iowa, so lots of historic fabric there.
And they took advantage of some historic tax credits that allowed them to renovate the building that they're in, and that was a big part of the incentive package that was put together for them.
For myself, no, I can't imagine that. I documented in my book how the share of state revenue coming from corporate income taxes has been falling a great deal over a long period of time. And I think it amounts to just a great burden shift. You have to ask yourself, where does the only 2 things can happen when companies don't pay their fair share of supporting public services that they directly benefit from. Either the quality of public services has to go down, or everybody else's tax rates have to go up. Something has to give, or a little bit of both. That's the only thing that can happen.
An interesting case study in that was when I was working for the state. We, every day almost, got beat up by Sioux City because South Dakota doesn't have corporate income tax. So Sioux City would always be beating on us as a state. What are you going to do about this? We can't compete with them. They don't have any corporate income tax. And I said, bring me the right kind of business and I'll compete with them any day. We have single factor corporate income tax, which means you only pay taxes on things that you're selling in the state. And then you also, you have to pay the bill somehow. So if you have a manufacturer that's exporting things outside of the state, they're going to pay taxes to Iowa, and you're going to build our tax base. Outside the state. What am I trying to say? They're bringing money in. You're not gonna penalize them. You're going to build your economy. If you're selling stuff just inside the state, you are going to pay taxes. Now, if you live in South Dakota and you use a lot of electricity, you're going to have to pay a lot of taxes, but you're not going to have to pay that electricity tax in Iowa because we're getting it another way. You're going to have to pay it somehow. I'm sorry, that was a convoluted answer.
Yeah, one of the controversies that the Iowa legislature has dealt with the last couple of years, and the right terminology eludes me right now, Greg, you might be able to help me, but it's the way that a lot of large corporations, and this would be true of a lot of the big box stores, the way they're able to apportion their revenues in such a way that they really avoid having to pay state taxes, and that is really a significant problem.
The classic case of that is Toys R Us, right, Greg? Where the giraffe for Toys R Us, Jerry, is a separate corporation from Toys R Us. It's Jerry Corp. And so Toys R Us, which will make, say $800,000 in sales at its store in West Des Moines, then takes that $800,000 and they pay it to Jerry Corp for the right to put the giraffe in front of the store, zero income. Because Jerry Corp is in Delaware.
They're called passive investment companies. It's chapter 4 of my book. Just replace 4 with 3 in the URL we sent you. And you can read about it. They're in Delaware, and they basically to license the use of a logo, a trademark, a slogan, a cartoon character. The national chains, and we know that many dozens of them have been revealed, pay royalties to the passive investment company in Delaware, basically flushing their profits out of 19 states that haven't fixed this loophole yet. And Delaware does not tax passive income. So it's called nowhere income. It is profits that are taxed nowhere.
Well, one of the ways that we've approached that in downtown Iowa City, as you know, we passed a zoning ordinance in throughout the city that separates liquor licensed establishments by 500 feet. So what we were saying is we don't want a concentration in any one area. So you get a lot of that, I think, through your land use and zoning policies.
Since you're talking about the opposite, the opposite of this is what's come to be called environmental racism, right? That is, if you look at the geography of highly undesirable places, waste incinerators, truck transfer operations, concentrated animal feeding operations, if they're not in very rural areas, often tend to be next to low-income people of color neighborhoods. So they have less political talk to resist them. People want to know what a TIF district is because that term's been used so much tonight. You need to know what a TIF district is because you have more than 2,000 of them here in Iowa. You're right up there with Minnesota, it's the nation's leader in TIF districts. The theory, TIFs are a classic case of a noble incentive that I believe kind of gone astray. The original idea was to revitalize parts of town that were really hurting. The idea is you define a small area, it could be just a few blocks, and call it a TIF district, and you say we're going to redevelop this area. And as a result of that redevelopment activity, the value of the buildings is going to go up because we're going to build new buildings and rehab existing buildings, and therefore the property assessments will go up, and therefore the property taxes will go up because the assessments will be higher. And when that happens, we're going to segregate the property tax revenue from the TIF district into 2 streams. The first stream, dedicated at the old property tax values, will continue to go where it always went. It'll continue to go to the school board and to the general fund, police, fire, and sanitation, and schools. But all the increase, which is called the tax increment, the incremental increase in revenue generated by the redevelopment activity, will be segregated and devoted just to help subsidize that redevelopment activity. And it can even be used to float bonds. It can be used to service the debt on bonds that are floated at the beginning of the process to support the redevelopment activity in the TIF district. In some states, TIF districts can last for 15 years or 23 years or even 35 years, as in Illinois. It's great to hear that you're doing it in shorter durations here. I don't know how short exactly, but in my opinion, the shorter the better because the bang for the buck is more evident. And one of the problems with waste, of the many problems associated with TIF, including sprawl, is that they often, in many cities, because the rules have gotten so loose, the TIF districts weren't hurting before they got defined. That is, they had naturally occurring property tax-based growth in them. But when the TIF district gets defined, it then captures all of the growth that occurs, whether or not it was pre-existing growth or newly induced growth. And therefore, you're taking a lot of money away from schools and other public services that would have been there if the TIF district had not been created.
Actually, here we continue to do the debt service with the increment for the schools, the county, and the city. So I think the example that we've provided is if there's a $40 per thousand in valuation increment, about $7 we recapture, and it's $33 available per thousand that's available for reinvestment or for incentives. So we're very cautious about that here because, I mean, county officials are often sort of beating on us about loss of revenue.
But it's important to note that, I mean, the caution in Iowa City is not necessarily matched by surrounding communities who are much more aggressive at using TIF.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that.
And-
I would not say that. but-
What sort of economic development would you propose for a small, struggling Iowa town?
Oh boy, that's without knowing more details about the particular town and the assets.
Oh, I can give you profiles.
And
You
I'll be
you
honest,
could too.
Our work is overwhelmingly, sort of metro and urban. I don't profess to have strong strength in rural.
Yeah, to that point, Greg, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to read the book Hollowing Out the Middle.
Great book.
Yeah, great book. Written by two East Coast sociologists who moved to a small, rural, northeast Iowa community for a number of years and essentially basically studied the young people going through their school system and where they went. And basically sowing the seeds of their community's own demise by the way in which they go about that. And to your point, a lot of the research has been done in metropolitan areas, inner city areas, but very little in rural areas. And that's a significant issue in the state of Iowa. I mean, we have literally hundreds of small rural communities that are literally withering away.
Our metro areas have grown, but they've grown from a lot of the small towns, feeding that. And so we're left with a lot of small towns with a lot of sewer issues, a lot of elderly to take care of. And, I just would be curious on the fix on how they're supposed to get economic development.
Yeah, well, as Dr. Berger was pointing out to me as we're walking around today, of your 99 counties, 66 populations peaked in the 1890 census.
Right.
So this is a very long-term historical reality about farms becoming increasingly mechanized and efficient.
You can
among
see
other
how
things.
it is hard for them not to rely on something like that.
And one thing you notice, I mean, if you want to look statewide at economic development programs, I mean, we have examples in settings like Iowa City, which, as Regina said, don't need to work that hard to attract. I mean, we're attracted to business already, so they're doing short-term tips and they're able to strike pretty good deals. If you go to some of the more rural counties that are really struggling, they're often using programs which don't have as high standards. For example, Iowa's Enterprise Zone program is written for struggling rural counties, and you qualify by having a percentage of the population that's over 65 or a percentage population loss between the last two census. So by definition, those struggling counties, and I think the Enterprise Zone is what, 80% of 90% of wages. So you have a economic development program that's designed to galvanize any investment in a struggling area, which is quite different from the logic in an area like Dubuque or Iowa City, where you're using those programs to really sort of bid up local wages because you have the luxury of doing so.
The other issue we have in rural Iowa is we have an agricultural commodity. And one of the ways that you make your state richer is you add value to that commodity. Mm-hmm. And those aren't very luxurious jobs sometimes. So we have the issue in rural Iowa of how do we get the workers to add that value and attract the plants that are going to do that. And that sometimes requires economic development that's not going to pay, jobs that aren't going to pay $60,000.
Well, we struggle with infrastructure issues, as you indicated, with sewer and maintaining roads to bring those plants to rural Iowa. So it's a huge question for the state.
I serve on an infrastructure committee now, and the number of cities that have sewers that need to be replaced, farm to market roads, and whether or not we keep those up or we let some of those go back. Even the planning for community buildings, school facilities, if you look at the projection of our population base, you probably want to be building the schools that are being built right now. So how do you push that planning while still keeping some sense of community?
And with the program that I work with in the state, and Mary's very familiar with the Vision Iowa program, the Community Attraction and Tourism, we are mandated to provide grants to smaller communities, $4 million of our allocation, a third every year. And I will tell you that many of those communities, they're also fighting on the quality of life aspects. They're building new libraries. They're doing a lot of things to be and remain competitive, but the fact of the matter is not all of them are going to make it.
Certainly, classical economic theory would argue that some communities in rural America, including Iowa, will become attractive by virtue of their low cost structure. That they will be rediscovered by people who see niche opportunities and kind of in smaller versions of Dubuque, really, right? And younger people will be attracted, and they create a class in miniature form, will be attracted to them. I should add that managing decline is not just a rural problem in America, right? You look at places like Youngstown, where the mayor there has sort of made a name for himself, literally shutting down entire neighborhoods and paying people to move out of neighborhoods that have become so sparsely populated that they need to have Rogaine over here and just let other ones go to seed. That's what they're doing in whole parts of Youngstown.
I think it's also important to remember that the overarching idea here is that the state gets into the business of subsidizing business investment to serve a public purpose, and the linchpin then is how do you define the public purpose, and it can be to make the market work more efficiently, and so you might have arguments that having those small struggling rural communities hold on is in the long run inefficient, that it doesn't serve a public purpose. You could make that argument.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a public purpose. We should have done a flashpoint on this before. So how many people in this room expect to have a higher standard of living than your parents? Really? Okay, great.
I'm glad my son didn't raise his
I hope that's not true, because many of the people just a little bit ahead of you in the labor market these days are not headed that way. And some demographers think you're going to get caught in the same vice. Please.
And that was just to cheer people up, Greg?
I have a quick question about the TIF incentives. When you're talking about saying that the areas of redevelopment and thus it brings up the property values and then property taxes, so does that mean that people who live in residential properties have a temporary increase in their property tax?
No, it doesn't. It's not. It's simply based on the fact that by improving an area and maybe adding more square footage and enhancements and better infrastructure and things, the correct assessment of the properties will rise, and therefore there will be an incremental increase in taxes.
So ABC company buys a piece of property that is maybe run down. They go in, they fix it up, their assessment goes up, and thus the property taxes go up, and the amount their property taxes go up, you can take and use to incent them, give it back to them.
Or invest in infrastructure that would help support that that development.
Local officials like TIF because in many states they're very flexible about how you can apply the money.
For instance, in Des Moines, we have a development that is just being opened. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Des Moines, but between Grays Lake and downtown is this big piece of land. It's south of Martin Luther King. It's kind of the new area for development down there, and we have an individual developer that bought up that area and wanted the tax increment used to get the sewer and water lines down into that area. So it was used to basically open up the utilities to that area.
And as Greg said earlier, one of the the key elements here is what economic development folks or law call the but-for test, which is would you have had the development anyway? Because then there really is no increment because you would have claimed it anyway. I think a good example in Iowa City is Sycamore Mall, which was a development which I was fairly critical of at the time because there's an argument that you don't TIF retail properties because you're just creating minimum wage jobs. But in fact, this is sort of infill development, rapidly declining taxable value, a largely empty mall, and now its valuation is
up
substantially. Like
yes.
We're talking 300%, and it retired its TIF.
And helped development in the area as well.
Right.
And we're looking for the same sort of impact in the Towncrest area, and anticipate that will also have a positive effect. And that is close to the slum and blight sort of approach. I mean, that's pretty close to meeting that standard.
The frustration in economic development is always measurement. I mean, you're never,
Right.
I mean, unless you can see into people's minds, and we don't have that technology yet, you're not going to know whether you were what made that difference or not, ever exactly for sure.
In the original sort of economic development, the original origins of redevelopment, public purpose was defined as redressing threats, actual threats to the public welfare. So safety and health, tearing down tenements, that sort of thing. Or a public purpose was a direct public use, like a railroad or a canal or something like that. But the definition of public purpose has slid over time. So now public purpose is a bigger tax base.